души поплыли туманы над рекой. Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой.
Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой.
Hello and welcome to Boys Club. Tonight we're going to be talking about feminism, and we're going to be doing talking about a lot of different parts of feminism. We're going to get into liberal feminism and go all the way through Marxist feminism and anything, in the undercurrents of that. And so we're not going to be able to do a really dig deep into what we're talking about. So if there is anything that we're bringing up here on this episode that you would like us to maybe, talk a little bit more about, just reach out and let us know. If there's anything on any episode we've ever done that you want us to talk about, reach out and we'll try to talk about it. If there's anything that you can just think of that you would like us to talk about, reach out to us and we'll try to talk about it for you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just go around and we're just going to give a little description of what we're going to be talking about. So first up is going to be me talking on liberal feminism and the history of liberal feminism. And I'll try to get through it as fast as I can. And just note, I am focusing on the United States. So after I get through that, we have Ash coming up. And Ash, can you let us know what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about Alexandra Kollontai and then also just feminism generally in view of the stars. So it will be about proletarian feminism.
Nice. And then it's going to come back to me for a couple minutes and I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that proletarian feminism with Cuba. And then we're going to take it to Crazy. Crazy, what are you going to be chatting about?
Basically, I'm just going to be pointing out, the intersectionality of feminism with Black liberation and be talking lightly on some Black known Marxist feminists like Angela Davis, Claudia Jones, and things like that, and just basically just whatever comes to mind, honestly.
All right, sounds good. And then finally, we're gonna go to Nico. And Nico, what will you be discussing?
I'll be discussing how capitalism and patriarchy function together and more of the modern Marxist kind of views on feminism, including housewifization of labor and how patriarchy and capitalism are basically do private accumulation of women's bodies.
All right, so let me just get into the liberal feminism history. As I said before, I'm doing this through the U.S. focus, so the history through U.S. So there was, you can kind of, like most Western states, kind of had similar stuff going on, and even colonized states had some of this stuff going on too, because the liberal feminism would find them there. Anyhow, so two things I want to bring up prior to the history. This is in proto-feminism. One thing is Nico's actually going to discuss it later on when we get there. But I want to bring up, because I think it's a very important point, and I want you to actually keep this in mind when Ash is talking about the USSR and I'm talking about Cuba and Crazy's talking about Black feminism and all that, is that from feudalism to capitalism, when we moved from feudalism to capitalism, women actually got more oppressed. Just keep that in mind. Nico will explain it to you, but keep that one in mind, because when you're looking at when we're moving from whether, USSR was kind of feudal or whatever, agrarian, moving into, communism, socialism, it was liberating. There was liberation for women. In these things, not perfect, not fully, but they actually got some rights. They got a lot of rights in the USSR and in Cuba. So just keep that in mind. The second point I want to bring up in proto-feminism is actually a person, and her name is Mary Wollstonecraft. She is the mother of feminism and the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, just because I know that and I have to put that out there. So she wrote in 1792 as a polemic against what was going on in the patriarchy that runs England, they decided that they don't think girls should get education anymore. They felt like domestic education. So depending on your class, like whether you learn how to like manage, your servants, or whether you're, learning how to cook and clean and stuff like that. Those are the only things they wanted you to have. So she writes a vindication of the rights of women. And so this becomes like kind of the first like feminist in the Western, in the Western. So then, you're in the Enlightenment and all that. And so liberalism springs out of all this. And now it's 1848 and we're in Seneca Falls in New York, and they have a women's convention. And who are the women that showed up there? There were a couple of working women, people that, lived there and did have the time to get there. But it was mainly the women that we'll call the women of leisure, or I'm going to call them the real housewives of Seneca Falls, I guess. They have they're saying like upper middle. We didn't really have middle class at that point, but like upper middle. So it was like women that had social, they could go out and socialize and stuff like that. Those are the women that were there, white women, right? So they're the ones that are leading the way. They decide they become the suffragettes. They take that on, that they're, the biggest thing they want to get is the vote, right? You have Black women like Sojourner Truth, who in 1851 goes to one of the women's conventions and gives her famous speech as "Ain't I a Woman?" And you also have Black women like Ida B. Wells, who were trying to kick it with the suffragettes, and they were like, not now, not your time. It's for the white women right now. So that's pretty much 72 years later, they do get the vote. And then in 1923, two congresswomen put in the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, for the first time. I'm going to, in 1972, that is put back through. And we were waiting for 38 states to sign on that. Finally, in 2020, we got the 38th state to sign on it. But you know what? Congress, and this was the most women ever in a Congress at the time, decided, it's been too long. Not every amendment had that. But, for this particular amendment, they decided to put 10 years on. So there's your liberal feminism. This is what it gets you. This is what liberalism gets you, is it's not time. It's not time, right? So what happens between the 1920s and 1960s? Not much. I mean, the anarchist feminists come out of Spain because the anarchist men are not listening to them. You have some undercurrents going on. You have like the working women. They were all along doing their thing, and then of course the Black women were always doing their thing. So you have like this undercurrents to the first wave and stuff like that. I want to bring up Louise Thompson Patterson. She comes up with a theory in 1936. She writes a piece called Toward a Brighter Dawn, and this is the triple oppression theory. And Crazy is going to get a little bit into like intersectionality and stuff. This is kind of a precursor to that. It's something that Claudia Jones, the Black Marxist from the United States, used in some of her writings. So then we get into the second wave, which is just basically the first wave. It's the white women again going like, oh, look, there's civil rights going on. Let's like, we started getting CEO positions and stuff like that. We now have to fight for our workers' rights. So let's do that. And so it was once again the white women leading the way, and white upper class, middle upper class women. So that's kind of where the Black feminists are kind of like, I've had it, right? So they kind of break off. You have the Marxist theory coming out in like the 70s, more, getting into like the domestic labor and stuff like that, which Nico's going to get into. You have the radical feminism comes out of here, which breaks into, that breaks up too. That not even just two, it breaks up into more, but you have the ones that turn into TERFs, and then you have the ones that like go out and do other things. Like we get into like the third wave in 1990, and that's the Anita Hill of it all. So this is kind of where the trans feminism comes out, like a little later than that, and ecofeminism. So some other things. There was riot girl feminism and all that stuff coming out there. And so, yeah, at the end of the second wave is where we get intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw writes intersectionality, which is a tool that we like to use both in when we're looking at feminism, and I've used it looking at disability and stuff. We've discussed that on our show before. So like the Anita Hill happens, so it becomes like this. We're not quite in the Me Too. That's the fourth wave that comes later in the 2010s, but we're actually in this kind of tell-all kind of thing. So this is where women are like realizing, have we all been? I mean, like literally, we start talking about it. I do have like a couple of issues. Like I'm going to say this. I am not a prude, but the sexual revolution. It should not have been done with the patriarchy so strong as it was. I don't. It should have been done in a different way. I think. I'm not sure. I'm just saying. As I grew up, I can get into it at some point, but like I don't think it really helped women in the way that they thought it was going to help women, and that's what happens under liberal feminism. It's just. Like overall, I feel like I don't see that liberal feminism's plans to break down the patriarchy. What liberals' plans are to like become the patriarchy or just be beside it. And that's what I get out of liberal feminism. So does anyone want to add anything to the horrors of liberal feminism?
I actually do want to add a little bit because you mentioned it way back. Sojourner Truth, her speech that her iconic speech, "Ain't I a Woman," the way that speech is written, and I put emphasis on written, is because it's written with this like very stereotypical, frankly uneducated Southern slave like drawl. That speech was written by a white woman that way on purpose. Sojourner Truth was actually incredibly intelligent and incredibly, I won't say educated, but it's like she was just really fucking smart, because a lot of people don't know or don't realize that she was a slave from New York. A lot of people forget that the Union State still had slaves. She was a slave from New York, and she actually spoke quite intelligently. And if you can try to find it, I suggest everyone actually read the original script. It was written by like this reporter for like another newspaper who was ironically enough a white man. And we even went over it with him to confirm like, yes, it's like what I said. It was a white woman that took what she said and then framed it in this very, uneducated way, because how dare a Black woman be articulate, And that's another example, I feel, ironically enough, is like, the horrors of liberal feminism, even though it wasn't, liberal back then, this idea of like, I took what this very intelligent Black woman said and just sort of, change it up to be, more, more digestible for other white people at that time, other white women at that time. Because again, how dare a Black woman actually be articulate?
May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if women have a pint and men a quart, why can't she have a little pintful? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have woman's rights, give it to her, and you will feel better. You will have your own rights, and they won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. And I've heard the Bible and I've learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if a woman upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right side up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? But the women are coming up, blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard.
I had to send it your way. I learned about it in English class, just the most unexpected place. They were like, oh yeah, we're gonna go over different speeches and we went over Sojourner Truth, and one of the main points was that's not the original. That is not the original speech. So yeah.
And you learn that in school, which is amazing.
It was more of a happy accident, I feel, when you really think about this was before Trump, okay? This was before Trump really did his damage. So, nowadays you may not even hear about Sojourner Truth, let alone whether or not that was the original, speech. But, I think it's because I live in a not a predominantly black city, but with a very, very, very large black population. So I think, they don't get away with stuff like that down here too much. So there's that.
All right. Nico, you want to add anything?
I was just going to add that even though we didn't have time this podcast, because there's a lot to talk about, when reflecting on liberal feminism, especially if we come back to feminism as a whole, or even just gender studies, outside of the people we talk about today, I will always say, please check out Leslie Feinberg. They were a queer, trans, Marxist activists here in the United States. They did so much work. They wrote so much on gender studies and the radical nature of challenging gender as a whole for women and the LGBTQ. And just check them out. One of their final quote literally was, "Remember me as a revolutionary communist."
Yeah.
And I feel like the people that we follow in our lives, that we see, who really honestly want our liberation, the women that want our liberation, the people who fight patriarchy, they're going to be communists.
Yeah. Yep. You're right. You're absolutely right. So, all right. So I'm going to bring this over to Ash, and she's going to talk a little bit about USSR and Kollontai.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the USSR and what they did for women's rights and trying to progress them. Of course, there was still some patriarchy in the Soviet Union, of course. And I'm in no way saying that misogyny was gotten rid of, but the strides that they had made were incredibly significant. One of the very first things that they did was putting equal rights for women in their constitution. First country to do so. They had many firsts for women, such as first woman cabinet minister and ambassador, which was Alexandra Kollontai, we'll talk about in a minute. They also attempted to collectivize domestic labor, which is really important. So they had cafeterias that anyone could go to, laundering their clothing, things like that. They're trying to do as much as they could. They also had free childcare. They started childcare very early. They were the first country to legalize abortion. And they were also the first country to do a no-fault divorce, which the United States didn't do until fairly recently, which is very significant for women. Especially our relation to property, that's incredibly important. And they also were the first country to or I think it was the first country in Europe, to not have like the church weigh in on a divorce, which is very important. So there was definitely a lot that they were trying to do for women. And just to like back it up for a second, I don't think that people realize that the revolution in Russia was actually sparked by women. So what had happened is that mothers had gone to demonstrate and protest because there was not enough food. They wanted bread for their children, and the Tsar opened fire on the crowd. So that's where we get International Women's Day from, is March 8th. And that was the day, it was the day that the February Revolution broke out. So it was literally sparked by women. And like, women's position in society in Russia was totally different than what it was in USSR, because as we know, like, Tsarist Russia was like a semi-feudal agrarian society. Women were not often able to work outside of the home. Many of them worked within the home. So things like they would like make things that would then be taken to market or things like that. But they had no guarantee to work or anything like that. When it becomes the USSR, they also grant women the ability to work no matter what. And also, like, you can no longer be fired for pregnancy, things like that. Sorry, it's a long list. It's a very long list of things that they did for women, and it's hard to get through.
So yeah, you can move on. We'll just know that there's much more to add.
It was genuinely so much.
Yeah.
But so Kollontai is very significant in all of this. So she originally starts out as like, she's like a social democrat in Russia, and then she's a Menshevik. She eventually leaves the Mensheviks for the Bolshevik. But she's very interesting. So she was incredibly inspired by Engels and the idea of abolishing the family. So most of her works are about that. She also was very much opposed to bourgeois feminism. So there were people who were trying to like organize the women at the same time as her in Russia and in Europe in general. And what she had pointed out is that those were bourgeois women who they just wanted like equal rights for themselves, but not for women who were like in poverty. Like they totally disregarded like the class position. And Kollontai, what she did is she organized the proletarian woman, and she was actually at one of the demonstrations in Russia. And saw like the crowd of women being abused, because there were multiple that had happened. And she originally comes from a very wealthy family, and she decided to marry for love instead. Her mom was very mad about this. She decides to go to school. Her mom hates that. She did end up marrying her first cousin, but like, I don't know. I'm not going to really talk about it. She ends up divorcing him later on so that she can pursue being a revolutionary, which she did very successfully. And she did a lot. She was the commissaire of welfare for the Soviet Union. She was an ambassador. She traveled all over the world. She worked all the way until her death in 1952 in the USSR. And then I do have like a couple quotes from her. I would really suggest that people read her. I'm definitely not doing her justice, but her writing is really wonderful.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of her quotes. Is the first one on family abolition. She says, "No more domestic bondage for women. No more inequality within the family. No need for women to fear being left without support and with children to bring up. The woman in communist society no longer depends on her husband. So that was one of her goals in the Soviet Union. So I really like this one from her. She says, to grant the woman worker the same rights as the man would be to put in the hands of the working class a new and dangerous weapon. To double the active army of the militant opponent, the bourgeoisie is too intelligent to agree to such a dangerous experiment. And she's talking about reform. So basically what she says, which I really agree with, is that you can't reform patriarchy. So like we can't reform our way into women's liberation. It isn't possible. It is too profitable and too convenient for the ruling class to decommodify women and our labor. Sorry.
I don't mean to correct you, but I want to add this so that people understand. As a social democrat, Lenin was a social democrat at the time. They were actually the communists. Just so you understand. I know Ash was saying that Kollontai was a social democrat. It's not the same sense in the Democrats that we have today. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cuba, but I didn't know if either Nico or Crazy wanted to weigh in on Kollontai and USSR at all before I get into Cuba.
The only thing I have to say is that the only reason why they gave a shit about women's rights in the U.S. was because of the USSR.
True. You all set, Nico?
Oh, I was just going to mention, it's a very small thing, but there is a book that I really like. I know some people have critiques on who wrote it, but it's called The Black Bolshevik by Harry Haywood. And it is there's a portion where he is in the USSR, and him and a few fellow Black Americans have gone to the USSR to study. And one of the people is a Black woman who got sick and passed away. And one of the most emotionally impactful things I've read in a very long time comes from the eulogy that the Soviets gave this woman for her bravery. And I don't think a lot of other works, or even during that time period, you would have that kind of like kindness and honor put towards a woman, especially a Black woman coming from the U.S. after everything they've dealt with. Having that, it's beautiful, and I really recommend reading it if you have a chance to.
All right, so for me, I was just going to get into some of the same kind of thing you're seeing here as like the reason why I brought up what Nico's going to discuss later on, the moving from feudalism to capitalism. This is where I wanted to look at, like, there was more oppressions for women, but you see where, like Ash was talking about the USSR, there was liberation for women, right? The same thing happened in Cuba. And, Ash was discussing how, they were, tied to, your domestic labor, and you're tied into your house. And then in Cuba, this was happening in a big way because the children, they weren't being educated. So there was no schools outside of the cities. So like 70% of the women were illiterate, and they had children who were illiterate, and they were just stuck in their houses. So first, like the 1952, the July 26th movement happened. So some women start getting into the revolutionary movement then. But then, later on, when, they come back on the grandma, the women were like, I was reading like these, their interviews with some of the women, and they're just like, we were free. Like we could do anything. Like they were tied in their houses. They had no social life. They had, nothing. And they just had their children, and they had to do the domestic labor for the husband. No, I was going to say it's not really the husband's fault at this point either, but like they just felt so liberated. They came out of there. If they had any reading or writing, they went right into education. They were teaching them, during the revolution, they were kind of the medics. So they started learning like medicine and stuff like that. This moved them into these jobs for later on. Vilma Espin is Raul Castro's wife, actually created the Federation of Cuban Women. And so she was really, don't even need to mention she's, one of the Castro's wives, because she like on her own, like she was doing so much. She was given, the job of, which was the most important thing, was the education thing. So like that kind of fell to her as a woman in the education part, kind of fell on her. And that, I mean, there was other men that were doing it too, but she was, that was a big part of her job, was teaching people how to, getting people to teach people how to read and write. So Fidel, when I found this out, like Fidel, like calls it the revolution in the revolution. That's what he calls. That's what he calls this. The women are having their revolution within the revolution. And to me, having like Fidel say that, like you think of all the machismo and everything that you put around, like him to just recognize that that happens and to talk about it in that way was very important. So under Batista, only 70% of women made up the workforce, and they were paid significantly less than their male counterparts. And most of those women were in the cities. Rural women were basically domestic housewives with no social interactions. The women of the 26 July movement were not just fighting for women, according to one leader. Her name is, I'm probably going to say it wrong, sorry, Marua Iglesias. Marua Iglesias wrote, "We are not fighting for women's rights. We are fighting for the rights of everyone." So that was, their quote was like more in line with the working women's that I was talking about as being the undercurrents of the waves of liberal feminism. That they were always working not just for their own rights, which they were working for women's rights in the workplace and stuff like that, but child protection and getting children out of the workplace and fighting alongside the male counterparts on what they were doing. So Vilma Espin founded the Federation of Cuban Women. Abortion was made legal in 1965, making Cuba the first Caribbean island to do so. Cuba was first to sign and second to ratify the UN's Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That took place in 1979. There are a few places that did not sign or ratify, and that was like Vatican City and a few places in Africa. So we can gather colonialism played a big part in that one. Then Iran, time frame 1979, Iran did sign and ratify, but then reversed the ratification afterward. And you can understand why that had happened too, because of the involvement of the United States. But the people that did sign and never ratified, there's a small country called Palau that never ratified it, and the United States never ratified it. So there you go. So I just said, we must allow these revolutions of oppressed people to be running alongside the liberation from the owning, ruling capitalist class. We need to allow all the revolutions to happen within the larger one, is what I wanted to add there, because I had people telling me, yeah, it's all class reductionist, and it just can't be that. So does anyone want to add to anything on that?
I mean, I would just say that kind of idea, I think, will go really into what Crazy is going to be talking about, is the class reductionism is inherently harmful because it completely ignores the importance of intersectionality and your positionality within intersectionality.
Yeah, for sure. Crazy, you want to add, or do you want to just get into your stuff?
You know what? With that transition, I'll just hop right in. Thank you for the alley-oop, Nico. But yeah, this is a good reason as to why, intersectionality exists. And in my video, I actually talk a little bit about the whole like leftist infighting video. I actually talk about, the difference between intersectionality and identity politics. And just to rehash a little bit from that video, identity politics is liberal because it's like class reductionism, but in the opposite direction, where it uses identity to try to overwrite class, whereas class reduction uses class to overwrite identity. And intersectionality is quite literally the middle ground between both of those, in the sense of like, hey, these things all affect each other. This is not something, nothing stands alone on its head. And class reductionists like to jump around the issue and go, well, you'll see all things, it comes from class, it comes inherently from a class structure. And it's like, literally shut up. Leave me alone. Just because it comes from capitalism, as all things do, does not mean it still doesn't affect people. It's like people who scream about how, race is a social construct, so therefore we shouldn't care about it. It's like, no. No. Something being a social construct has never stopped it from hurting a person. And some good example of a book that I read, it was a while ago, and I might need to reread it myself. There's this book called Hood Feminism. It's by the author Mickey Kendall. And it is a very good book. And Mickey Kendall is obviously a Black woman. And I think like the subtitle on the book is literally, notes about women that the revolution forgot. And it talks a lot about how a lot of issues are both, racial issues and class issues. One that she talked about in particular, I think, comes in the form of like welfare. Most people on welfare are white, first of all. In fact, I want to say, like, on a little side tangent, the idea of a welfare queen is a racist idea that, like, Black women are all using welfare, blah, blah, blah. That came from a white woman. Like, the actual term welfare queen was applied to a Black woman in, like, the 1940s or something. I meant to a white woman in 1940. Like, her name was literally, like, Linda. It's hilarious when you think about it, but it's also incredibly sad. But yeah, just as a side note, welfare queen literally referred to a white woman. But she talks about like how, again, no, most people on welfare are white. A good number of, say, single women or single mothers tend to be on welfare, and because of that allows them to tend to be POC as well. And, the idea of a mother not being able to feed her children is 100% a feminist issue. And it's also a class issue, because usually these are working class women, these are poor women. But it's also a racial issue because poverty, as we know, disproportionately affects minorities. And so it's these like little things that we just sort of like forget that like this affects other people too. Another one is healthcare. Healthcare, again, it disproportionately affects minorities. They usually have more health issues because they live in worse environments. They live in places where they don't have that much of access to healthcare. And then on top of that, it affects women because the medical field and the history of the medical field literally is based around the study of white male bodies. And the things we do know about women come from the torture, frankly, the medical torture of Black enslaved women, and that carries on both in the racial context of Black people don't feel as much pain, and also in the way that women are just treated in general, which is why your gynecologist uses a literal metal contraption and sticks it into your body and thinks that that's somehow a good idea. Like, the way that women are treated in the medical field is just degrading overall, because the way that we learned about women's bodies were inherently degrading and torturous. And so, like books like that, it really teaches people like, this is why we have to care about things from more than just one angle. And also just, the importance of Marxist feminists and Black Marxist feminists in particular, like, for example, Angela Davis. Angela Davis, she wrote the excellent book Women, Race, and Class. And, the book, it talks about, like being a housewife and the history of how, Black women were usually the starting point for modern day feminist issues, like for them, like voting, but then after a while, like white women and Black women, they were kind of like in it together. They're like, this is for women. We need to break the vote and all that. But then after a while, white women were like, I mean, if we had to pick between the both of us, right? And it's like, what, huh? How do we get here? What do you mean? And the white women be like, kind of white people need to vote, And it's like, what are you talking about? And, how they would just abandon Black women on the side and just, and it just sets people back for no reason other than just because race was just something that they could hold on to. And then we also have other important figures such as Claudia Jones, who kind of, who was kind of like someone a little bit early to the intersectionality game, and how she would talk about, like triple oppression and things like that, and how, again, issues affect people, and people are affected by issues in more than just one way. And I think it laid like the groundwork for intersectionality, even though, again, it comes from so many different other things as well. And then on top of that, you have other feminists like Assata Shakur, and how she was treated is a very much a feminist, Marxist, and Black issue all on its own. And then you also have how Black women have been seen in the overall feminist movement and Marxist movement by even other Marxists. Like, for example, Frantz Fanon, as much as I love him, he has some kind of backwards views on women, and there's the autobiography of Malcolm X, which now people don't talk about because it's very disturbing. Like, there's like an entire chapter, I believe, in that book where he is just talking about how he would, when he was younger, he would just roam around the neighborhood and just sexually assault Black women. I forgot what the justification or what his reasoning was for that, but like, it's a hard read, and you're kind of just sitting here like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting, Malcolm. Thank you for that extra information, I guess. And and how a majority of Marxist literature is written from the male perspective, even though I do think some men really do hit it out of the park. Like, again, Frederick Engels with his Origin of the Family and things like that. So we always should try to do our best to understand that there's more than one way to skin a cat. There just isn't one universal way that everything affects everyone. It just is impossible. And we don't do ourselves any favors not acknowledging that, basically. One thing I do want to touch on as well is women's labor, just overall in the proletarian movement, is that, you guys know Rosie the Riveter, right? When you imagine her, you probably imagine the one that's like, her arm, like, oh, we can do it. That's not Rosie the Riveter. That's complete propaganda. That Rosie the Riveter, the we can do it one, comes from the White House factory. That particular image was a singular poster out of a series of posters that they posted in one specific place at one specific time. And the fun fact about that poster is that it's actually a anti-labor poster, because it's the capitalist form of the hang in there cat, where they were like, oh, we can do it, ladies. We can just fight through it to keep them from striking, because I don't think I have to tell you this, working conditions during wartime was really, really bad. Yes, even for women. And the Rosie the Riveter that was actually known at that time was drawn by Norman Rockwell, who is also a very fantastic artist in his own right. And it just goes to show that, women's labor loves to be used as a supplement or a substitute to men's labor. But at the end of the day, it's treated just like men's labor, because women uniting and striking during a literal war effort would be detrimental to the U.S. war machine at that time, even though women at the time were not really seen like as they were today. They were not seen as like legitimate laborers. It's the same way how, again, Black people were seen as like, substitute labor to white people during the Great Depression. When people were out of a job, a lot of white people's opinion at the time were like, hey, Black people, we're not really nice to you, and we're just not going to be nice to you anymore than we are now. Can you like quit your job so like white people can have a job? Can you like do that for us real quick? And it's like, no. It's like, fuck off, maybe. Like I don't know what to say to you. Like, it's this idea that it's just not seen as legitimate or as good. Same with how disabled people are seen. They're seen as useful as far as their disability can be monetized. Same thing with women. Their labor is seen as useful as far as it can be put, as far they can extract something out of it. Same thing with Black people. We were seen as useful. We were seen not even as people until it kind of just became useful to do so, or until, we literally just revolted 1,000 times until it happened. And so, yeah, like women's labor and just like women labor and Black labor, it mirrors each other so much that unless you are truly trying to study this stuff, again, like how people say, you're not going to have a full and complete understanding of the revolution unless you read Black revolutionaries. You're not going to have any better of an understanding if you don't read more female authors. Frankly, don't read more from women's perspectives, whether it's trans women, cis women, single women, non-binary femmes. Like you're not going to understand this unless you look at all perspectives, frankly.
Yeah, you have to get it from the source. I wanted to add, like, when you were talking about, like the men, and even Ash had brought up that, the men, there was still like the patriarchy to deal with, in the USSR and stuff, and that was still true in Cuba and all that. That there was this one clip of Elaine Brown talking from 2008 that I really like. She's at a women's conference and she says, I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember exactly what she says, but she's like, people will come up to me like, you are like feminist, like you push for women's rights and stuff, but you were in the Black Panthers and they were very, chauvinist. And she's like, of course they were fucking chauvinist. They were men. We didn't get them from revolutionary heaven. They still had so much to work on. And so like that,
She talked about that in her you said
Elaine Brown, yeah.
What's her name again?
Elaine Brown. Yeah.
It wasn't, I was thinking about Asada again. And she also says the same thing.
Yeah, she said something.
She said the same thing in her biography. She was like, yeah, as a woman, I had to tell a lot of these men constantly, like, as a woman, I don't think my opinion is as valued in this organization as it should be. And she was like, and the men would kind of brush her off because they would get a lot like machismo about it. They would be like, well, you see, you're just a woman and we're men, we're protecting our community and things like that. And it's just like, yeah, but, part of protecting your community is also protecting, the ability for your women to be able to speak at all. If I, as a Black woman, cannot speak out in white supremacist society, and I also can't speak out in the Black community, where am I supposed to speak?
Yeah.
And that's why when Huey Newton said his speech, why he was like, part of truly being revolutionary is not, punching gay people in the face and telling them to shut up. It's about, reevaluating our value system and truly trying to make a truly revolutionary society that accommodates all people, period.
Yeah. Yep. Nico, you want to add anything?
I'm just going to say that I think I have a quote that I'm going to save to the end that kind of really reflects on, kind of the proletariat man, especially, and how they view women in the long run. That'll go really well with what you said.
All right.
Hello, everyone. everyone. This is Boys Club Breaking News. I'm your reporter here, Crazy 101, and I would like to report back to you on a situation that happened in our last podcast, specifically our aesthetics to fascism pipeline, particularly on my segment about Sydney Sweeney and her American Eagle ad. As you would know, Sydney Sweeney did an ad with American Eagle that essentially talked about her great genes, but all of us with two brain cells rubbed together know that that's not acceptable. They tried to play it off as a play on words between jeans with a J, as in the denim that you wear, and genes as in your genetic genes. But even then, even if it was just a simple play on words, it's not acceptable. And we have like literal photographic evidence of them saying not Sweeney Todd, Sydney Sweeney has great genes. She does not. She is just a regular white woman. But an update nonetheless is that Sweeney not Sweeney Todd, that Sydney Sweeney did a interview with GQ, and in that interview she was asked directly about people's interpretation of the American Eagle ad, because obviously many people saw it as racist and promoting eugenics and white supremacist beauty standards. Sweeney said, and I quote, "People are going to have to understand that I am more aware than they think I am. I'll let you do with that as you will." Frankly, again, everyone that is not going to simply sit by as a gene company tries to promote eugenics saw that as Sweeney's pretty much open endorsement. Anything other than just, yes, I'm a white supremacist, her more or less nonchalant endorsement of eugenics, and how it is, again, pretty obvious what these companies are doing if you simply just wake up and see. And it also confirms exactly what we were talking about in the last episode, that companies nowadays more and more and more are getting open with their fascism. Also, as an update to that update, Sweeney has been dropped by American Eagle. They actually do not care about her whatsoever. And now, after the fact, she's trying to scramble to get her job back by saying that she does not support the interpretation and actually doing the things she should have did the first time. But too bad, American Eagle has their money, and Sweeney is going to be thrown to the Eagles. Well, the fascist Eagles, the same ones that she modeled for. And another story that is in relation to this one about how companies still want to push fascist rhetoric is that Walmart really loves rock, paper, scissors. And you may understand rock, paper, scissors as an innocent childhood game, but apparently Walmart wants to have a different interpretation, as recently they got into some hot water when there were shirts on their website that said the phrase "paper beats rock," which depicts a hand saluting in a fascist Nazi salute, and the Black Power fist underneath it. And another small detail that people seem to miss is that the white version of the shirt costs more than the black version of the shirt. Let you sit on that one. And the white version of the shirt costs more than the black version of the shirt. We love racism. And that obviously it is a massive, massive, massive fascist dog whistle. So now, of course, the excuse, as always, is that Walmart does have third-party vendors and that they simply just, slipped under the radar, as, things like that innocently do. And that, they are very, very sorry about having this product, blah, 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 blah. We know that they're lying. Walmart is a billion-dollar company. They have no reason, they have no excuse. Any excuse you can make up, they can literally fix it because they are a billion-dollar company. They can hire more people. They have more time. They can literally build a data center for an AI to scan your website to find stuff like that if they literally wanted to. They don't want to because they don't care, because fascism is profitable and they want to make a profit, because Walmart is not Walmart if it's not making a profit. And so, again, please be very, very, very aware that your aesthetics, where you buy, where you sell, is very, very, very extremely political, and these companies do not care. Fascism is more profitable than it ever has been, because fascism, as Lenin said, is capitalism in decay. Please stay bright, comrades, stay vigilant, and that has been Boys Club News.
All right, so with that, we'll get into with Nico. Nico, share with us what you're gonna tell us tonight?
Yeah, so my focus this week was on more modern, in a sense, feminist, Marxist feminists, particularly writers who have kind of appeared outside of, outside of like the second and third wave feminism during the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is a time period where you began to see across the globe more of a viewpoint of analyzing things like archaeology and sociology directly through a feminist lens. So you get kind of this interesting perspective of some of these Marxist sociologists who, in the 80s and 90s, kind of became the founders of ecofeminism, write about how patriarchy and capitalism are uniquely tied together, but how patriarchy isn't just the oppression of women. It is the exploitation and oppression of the world and the global South. And that patriarchy gives capitalists a very like kind of standard blueprint in which to, exploit and assault both women, the earth, and the global South. My three books that I was reading through, one's a classic that I've read all the time. I've read multiple times. I have reviewed it for this episode. Though I am going to give the caveat of, as a non-binary person, I really enjoy this work, but the author is a rad femme in the way that they are a TERF, and that should be noted. The work is still important, but her more modern current work should be ignored because of her anti-trans stances. But Caliban and the Witch is a really important book that expands directly on the transition, that's the word I'm looking for, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and how patriarchy played a very important role for capitalism to get its foothold. It discusses a lot the way that we view gendered labor begin to become truly defined. It was during this like mercantilism, feudalist period into capitalism that we really see this get defined as to like what is a woman's job in society. Why is it important that a woman has children? And also, what do we need to do to isolate women from other women and to punish them for being connected to the earth more, being more communally focused, so that they will no longer have that kind of thing to turn to. One of the things they focused in on the most is witch hunts. It's a really interesting portion of the book. Witch hunts for a lot of people seem to be kind of like this Christian fanaticism against like, paganism and devil worship. But both Caliban and the Witch and the next book I'm going to mention discuss how witch hunts were developed to make profit. Lawyers, the people who caught witches, they were paid quite a bit to do so. And it was set up to across most of Europe for women to be completely dispossessed of all their property, of all their lineage, of all their own profit for their own labor, so that it could be given to the people who charged them, for the people who captured them, for the people who tortured them. And it became big business. And the capitalists realized, A, it's good for business, but B, it makes women fall in line. No other woman wants to be told that they're a witch and be tortured and possibly killed and have everything they've worked for taken from them. So women stopped practicing medicine. And it was during that time that during the Enlightenment period and soon after that, that this kind of idea that science and medicine were distinctly a white man, a white European man's profession, where historically across the globe and even in Europe, that stuff was practiced by women. So that book goes into that very, very deeply. And then they start talking about, and this goes into Maria Mies's book, Patriarchy and the Accumulation on the World Scale, about how they had to give women a new role. And this role was, we need them to be beneath us as a man, but we need them to continue to produce things for us. So that's where you start to get this idea of women stay in the house, they don't do trade, they are here to take care of the children and take care of the house. And that spreads basically very rapidly across Europe, where, you know, back in the day, there wasn't that necessary like divide of labor. Like the men were like the woman went out and tilled the farm, like the farmland. Both parents came back and cooked. Actually, it was usually mostly a community that would come back together and cook, you know, things like that. And women started getting this responsibility of, you have to be the one who cooks and cleans for unpaid labor, because in the end, just like with a lot of things, I'm sure, what Crazy has mentioned is that women at that time were no longer, or hadn't to that point really hadn't been seen, but were definitely through capitalism defined as property. And with that, you begin to see, Maria Mies talks about it, how this idea becomes the thought process of the colonizer, of the imperialist, that, you know, even though our, you know, our European women are below us, there's someone that can even be below them. And they also start to push that on to other societies. There's writing in Maria Mies's book where she discusses, or she quotes a written piece where a colonizer talks about how the thing that they have to teach the men of that colonized country is that their women need to be below them. And that's the only way that they will ever be as civilized as a European country. And with that, they Maria Mies kinds of expands, and this term, like this type of kind of eco-feminist, Marxist feminist kind of viewpoint, starts to go into how patriarchy, because of that viewpoint of someone always being lower, they expand to that to the global south. They expand that to colonize people, to imperialize people, of the man, the European man has to be above everyone else. It is natural for them to plunder and exploit, because that is just the role of man, and thus the capitalist. And it makes me think, let's see, I'm trying to look at one of these quotes. Yeah, here, this is my quote. This comes from the essay I'm about to move into, which taught me a lot about the a term I'm about to bring up, and then I can wrap this up and we can go into discussion. But Claudia van Warhoff, who wrote "The Proletarian is Dead, Long Live the Housewife," has this really interesting quote, actually two. I'm going to read both of them. "The woman's question is the most general and not the most special of all social questions, because all others are contained in it, because in contrast to all the questions to date, leaves no one out. The claim reflects not conceit or arrogance, but on the contrary, it reflects something inherent in the functioning of our society itself. For our society itself has created an historically unique situation, namely the situation that women are always the ones below, but only from below, hence at the bottom of the cast, can the whole be seen as the whole. Nothing is more important, actually, nothing is more vitally necessary than to support this tendency of an analysis from below. And that's where, like intersectionality comes into play, because these ecofeminists, this was a Marxist sociologist, begins to talk about no one can honestly see the full picture unless, because of how society has basically created an unjust hierarchy, the fact that you have to be at the bottom to see the whole picture. And that's the positionality of intersectionality that has to be recognized. And that patriarchy has kind of been one of the first oppressions, if not the first, in the sense of kind of creating that positionality. And it's important for all people who call themselves feminists to recognize that positionality is important, that intersectionality is important, and how much patriarchy is tied into the functionings of capitalism, and thus also tied into the functionings of racism and homophobia and ableism. Those all have to be considered. But the next quote goes into the thing I want to talk about the most, and it was from The Proletarian is Dead, Long Live the Housewife. And it was also mentioned in Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, but it's this idea of the housewifeization of labor. And The Proletarian is Dead, Long Live the Housewife goes into detail about how the proletariat in a more modern day is kind of disappearing, that the housewifeization of labor is seen as unfree, unpaid labor. It is the labor that you are forced to do because society has given you no other choice. It is expected and unpaid. And though women and BIPOC people and people from the global South have especially experienced this, since, this was written in like the late 80s, there's been a discussion about how, the European proletariat man is beginning to experience this too, in the sense, and that's why it's finally becoming important to them, is, we're finally seeing a change, and it's why women have to be on the side of the global South more than ever, because the European or white man will be like, I'm being treated like a housewife. I'm expected to do gig work. I'm expected to do all these other things while I work. But when I get this freedom, when you address my issues as a proletariat, that's all I need. I won't continue with the exploitation. That's why it's important here as someone especially like me, a Western white femme presenting person, that, I fight for. My feminism should mean addressing the patriarchy that is used to exploit the global South and their housewifeization of their labor, because it's the most oppressive and deadly form of it. But if I wanted to wrap it up, I'm going to wrap it up with this quote, which I literally, when I was reading it, ran out into the living room to basically yell it at my partner because of how intensely it fucking hit for me. But it's, whether priest, development expert, entrepreneur, minister, or husband, none of them would like to be reminded that they are just that, only because the partners, as they are called today, are heathens, underdeveloped, exploited, subjugated, or women. So the heathen, the backward and exploited, and the housewife must remain what they are. Indeed, their roles must be filled so that the priest, the developer, and the proletarian can become what they are. So this integration of the former people into the roles of the latter is out of the question for them.
Wow. Yeah. That's a good quote. Yeah.
It is.
I was just gonna like while you were talking about that for me, like I can, I was a stepmother. I did stuff like that, but I wasn't full time mother, so I can't really talk about, the children aspect of it. But you know, I had even before I stopped work, I became caregiver for my parents. So like I was doing it while being sick and almost going disabled. Like I mean having to go disabled later, but I mean like I was doing that stuff too, like running around doing a lot of caregiving stuff, not so much for my father at the time, but my mom. So yeah, I mean it's unpaid, and that's another thing. It's usually women that become the caregivers for the elderly too. So you know, but Ash, did you have anything to add since you're the mom here?
Yeah. No, a lot. It's the proletariat of the proletariat. Learning that phrasing for me a couple years ago put things into a lot of perspective for myself. I have been a stay-at-home mom, I have been a working mom, and I just have to tell you, it just doesn't matter either way. Either way, you're doing the majority of the care for the house, for the children, because we just have such like a lack of resources for families in general. And so oftentimes it has to be whoever is more employable has to be the person who works outside the home. And oftentimes, because of patriarchy, the person who is getting offered more hours or better pay is the husband, if there's a husband or man partner or whoever in the house. And I think it's also really like stigmatized to be a stay-at-home mom. I think a lot of times it can be a place of privilege to do that. But I would say most people that I know who are stay-at-home parents are not doing that because that's what they want to be doing or because they're in a financially good position. It's actually because it's totally and completely unaffordable for both parents to work. There's so many like huge issues with this. And like the liberation of women is also the liberation of children. And I think that doesn't get talked about very often. Like feminism, Marxist feminism is not just about women. It is the non-man, right? So anyone who's not a man benefits from Marxist feminism in a really big way. Like I think that we oftentimes don't talk enough about the liberation that communism provides to children. So things like having access to childcare is not just for the parents, it's also for the children. It gives them a better quality of life. It gets them out of the house. I mean, we don't even have like third spaces for children in society, in capitalist society, that are not behind like paywalls. Like it's incredibly isolating financially. It also like being a stay-at-home parent like increases the possibility for like experiencing abuse. Like many people who experience domestic violence are stay-at-home parents who have been isolated and alienated from society, from the workforce, who are forced to be in a position where they're now like financially dependent on a partner, things like that. It's very important.
No, absolutely. I was going to say, like, even from my own experiences of not being a stay-at-home mom, but just being, someone who's disabled, who's unable to work, in very various moments in my life, I have been stigmatized for this kind of idea of, well, if you can't work, then you should be at home cleaning all the time. Oh, you're so lucky that you have a person or a man that's willing to accept you because you can't work and you're disabled. Doesn't that make you feel unvaluable? I've been told this stuff. And I've also had people who seem to be pretty progressive at the very least, who, when I expressed my experiences of abuse and that I was stuck because I couldn't find a job and I was basically a stay-at-home girlfriend in a very real way. I took care of the house as best as I could. That kind of like, well, sorry, it's better than you being homeless. You know, like, what do you want me to do about it? And, you know, even for this situation like me, I've been very lucky. I have a partner for 10 years. And one things that made me kind of be like, okay, my partner's not a piece of shit, was he went, that's unacceptable. Just come stay with me. You shouldn't be abused. Like, there's no excuse for that. But you'd be surprised at how many people see a femme presenting person being abused, and especially if they're disabled as well, which kind of ties into each other. They're, you know, you kind of like just deal with it. What else is there for you? You're not valuable to us.
Yep, you're right. Crazy, did you want to add anything to this, or?
So yeah, I want to add on to this, particularly to two parts. With Nico, when you talking about the housewife, I always think of every single time, you know, because this goes back to our earlier conversation, our earlier podcast about, like, you know, the aesthetic pipeline and how, like, trad wives is a really big part of it. The thing I always want people to realize is that the trad wife aesthetic is racist as well as classist. And the reason why it's racist is because, notice, the primary people who are trad wives, predominantly white. Of course, you have people like Nora Smith, but, like, it's predominantly white. And also, too, the trad wife life, the idea of even being a housewife, is not possible for all women in society, not even by a long shot. Women who are poor cannot be housewives. Women, most of the time, who are minorities cannot be housewives. The actual history of being a housewife is a racist history based off of slave-owning women. They were allowed to be housewives because they were using the labor of their literal slaves to do the housework for them. So the original housewife wasn't even a housewife, and how we understand it today. They weren't doing the chores. Other people were. It is an inherently, like, exploitative position. And so this idea of, like, you know, oh, women gotta stay at home, be a housewife. Somebody, somebody has to be at home doing all this stuff. It comes from literally being a slave. They cannot handle the idea of the house just being a house, you know, like, someone just has to be home, at the home, doing something all day. Someone has to be doing this constant labor all day, and it has to be a thankless job. And that's where we get this idea from, and why the idea of the housewife is very, very, backwards. That's why I don't support people that are like, real feminism is women being able to choose to stay at home. No, just drop that already. That's called choice feminism, and it's extremely lazy. It does not examine why the housewife even exists to begin with, and why men in particular tend to be so adamant on women getting back home and staying in the kitchen. Like, they want a slave. That's just as simple as that. And another part is on the idea of, like, this caregiver role. And we see time and time and time again in society that women tend to be the ones that pick up a lot of the caregiving roles in their family, especially when other members of their family get sick. I'm experiencing that my own self right now. Both of my parents are sick in some way, and I have to be the one to stay at home to take care of them because they're sick old people. Like, what are they going to do? And so, you know, and I see on TikTok in particular, like, it wasn't really like a trend, and it wasn't really a discourse. It was more just like, you know, people sharing their experiences, and how a lot of them fall into this world of, like, you know, what it is to be an older sister, you know, like, or like the eldest daughter sort of thing, where it's like, they're the ones that have to, you know, handle taking care of the younger kids. They're the ones who, like, just sort of like all of, like, they're kind of like the third parent in a way, where all the things that the two parents can't do for their kids immediately gets dumped onto them. And it doesn't happen with older sons, because usually the older sister's the one that's taking care of the eldest son anyway. You know, this idea that women constantly get this extra labor dumped onto them. And part of it is because they are not seen as legitimate members of the working class, both because of patriarchy, again, because of racism, and because of classism, And, it kind of goes with how Ash was saying, like, being a woman in a lot of these relationships is kind of like being the proletariat, in a way, because so much of the labor and just idea of how class is structured is always based off of exploiting someone else's labor. Like, it is both bare bones. Capitalism is about using someone else's labor, so to either dump that on to them, that the stuff you did you don't want to do, or to use the value extracted from that labor to benefit and step up yourself. And that's why a lot of these concepts, when you really tear it down, you just see capitalism again. That's why I suggest everyone needs to read Engels about the origin of the family, because it's like the very structure of capitalism permeates even within family structures themselves. And, it's very important that people are privy to that and deconstruct those things.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a very important piece. I was just telling someone earlier, they're like, oh, should I read that? I'm like, yeah, it's hard to get through at the beginning because it's some outdated anthropology terms and stuff like that, but it is a very important piece. So I guess with that, we're just gonna wrap it up. And I don't know, does anyone want to add anything? All right, so good night, everyone. Good night. Say goodbye, everyone. All right.